As you can all hear, the recording is in progress for this session, and the session will be uploaded on the YouTube. I am Swati Vermani, a senior lecturer in economics from De Montfort University, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues here who will be presenting on how do we use AI effectively for our students' learning and engagement. So I'm joined by Nazneen Khazra from University of Toronto, Theodore Savras from Harvard Kennedy School, and Christian Todd and Omar Siraz from Bonn-Heinz-Sieg University of Applied Sciences. All the talks are around AI and their usage. A few housekeeping tips before we begin. So as you all know that the session is being recorded, there's an option to enable closed captions, so they are at the bottom of your screen. During the presentations, attendees are encouraged to put all the questions in the chat. If there are any sort of immediate clarification questions that account for any of those talks, we'll ask them just after the talk. Otherwise, we'll collate all the questions and do a panel sort of a discussion towards the end. Each presenter will have between 12 to 15 minutes, and I would request all the presenters to keep their videos on, and once you've presented, to mute yourself. So without any further ado, I will request Nazneen to stop sharing her screen and begin the presentation, please.
All right, great. Thanks for having me. I'm going to start my timer. All right, amazing. So I'm going to talk about how I use ChatGPT and other AI platforms to improve some elements in my course and to also promote critical thinking and learning. All right, okay. So one thing that we all have in mind is how to think about this future-focused education. What do we teach our students today to make sure that they find jobs tomorrow in this unknown job market that we are all worried about? So in this 30-second interview, I put the YouTube link up there. The interviewer asks Sam Altman this exact question: what do you think kids should be studying these days? And these are the main points that he mentions: resilience, adaptability, high rate of learning, creativity, familiarity with the tools. And I'm going to talk about one of my courses that I designed keeping these points in mind. Another question that the interviewer asks is, should kids still be learning how to code? And so most of my courses are focused on coding, and this is a question that I have in mind, like, should I teach them how to code, or is this going to be irrelevant in the future? And Sam Altman says, learning to code was great as a way to learn how to think. And I'm trying to keep this in mind when I teach them coding. It's not just about coding, it's about learning how to think, which will be a very valuable skill in this unknown job market. So this is the course that I'm going to talk about. It's called Big Data Tools for Economists. And it's an interdisciplinary course that's teaching these new tools to students. These are some of the topics that I cover. I talk about data visualizations, some GIS mapping, web scraping, running OLS and machine learning models. And these are some topics that hopefully will be helpful in their future job market. And I have 4 scaffolding projects as the method to evaluate them. And in these projects, I try to enforce critical thinking, and I'm trying to let them explore and learn how to learn, which will be, again, a very valuable skill in the future. And the language is Python, not just to code, but to think. The projects are executed as the following. So each student is assigned to a real-world data set. These are raw data sets. They have to clean them themselves, and they choose their research question, and then they write their individual projects, the 4 projects that are all related to each other, and the final paper. To just give you an idea of what the projects look like, I'm listing the main theme of these projects. In project 1, they get comfortable with the data. They do some visualizations and mapping. In project 2, they do web scraping. and merge new data sets. In project 3. Project 4, they run regressions and machine learning models. In the final project, they format this entire process into a formal paper. An interesting way that we evaluate these projects is that we give them individual comments, and then in the subsequent project, they will be evaluated on how much of this feedback they have incorporated into their new project. For example, in project 2, we're going to have 30% of the grade, depending on how much of our feedback they've incorporated. And this kind of addresses one concern that we have regarding ChatGPT, and simulates an individual test environment for students. Because even if 2 students have similar projects using similar data sets, we're still giving them different feedback, and they have to, for example, create a new map for one project and a new table for the other. So that's one way that we evaluate them. And like any research project, one of the hardest steps is to come up with an executable and interesting research question. And this course is offered at the second-year level. Some third-year undergraduate levels, undergraduate students also take this course. So imagine a second-year, third-year undergrad student wanting to design a research question. That's a very challenging task. And in the previous iterations of the course, I had to have one-on-one meetings with students to polish their research question, get them to think about heterogeneities and other things. But with one new exercise that I designed this last iteration of the course, I was able to get them to writing a nice research question very fast, just in the beginning stages of the research. So this is a summary of the exercise. If you want the full exercise, I can share the PDF with the audience later. Just send me an email and I'll send it to you. I asked them to upload a sample of the data or explain their data to ChatGPT, and then ask ChatGPT to come up with 10 research ideas. And in part 2, they had to select 5 and polish it, and then explain the potential challenges for these 5 different research ideas. So this is the critical thinking part that this exercise allowed me to incorporate this year, because previously I had to have one-on-one meetings and ask them about potential challenges for all of these research ideas that they had. But with this back and forth with ChatGPT, this was easier and more effective, and they could learn how to learn and also think critically about these research ideas. And then they had to, again, go back and forth and then finally choose one research question. So this is a sample work from one of the students that worked with Boston crime data sets. This is an administrative data with latitude and longitudes of the crime, the characteristics of the type of the crime, the people involved, whether or not this was a shooting, whether or not it was fatal, and so on. And if you look at the questions that ChatGPT proposed to the student, these are very interesting. They talk about heterogeneities and many other things. For example, in question 7, the question is, do crime prevention feats in an area lead to movement of crime to an adjacent area? So this is about spillover of a policy, and it's very hard to get a second-year undergrad student to think about spillover effects and heterogeneities. And this was an amazing first step for this student. And then they chose 5 questions, and then they thought about potential challenges that they might face. For example, I have to come up with a measurement for migration of crime, which is quite challenging. And then eventually the student chose this question: do street level factors and time of day influence crime pattern? This is already an interesting question. They started with this question in their project 1, and then they changed it to incorporate some other heterogeneities, income disparities. And then in project 4, they got to a very clean, interesting, and doable research question: how does street lighting impact night crime? This is very interesting and important question for second-year level student, and it's still challenging because they had to scrape the location of street lighting. They had to do some geocoding, and run some very complicated machine learning models, but they could get to this research question because of that ChatGPT exercise. And through that process, they learned to think critically about a research question and not just jump into running regressions. Another exercise that I had for this past year was to use AI for literature review. This is another quite painful step in any research process, but very important to have a good literature review. And one problem that I had in the past was to explain to students what I mean by situate your research question within the literature and tell me where you are. And with this exercise, I was able to get to that point faster, and I'll explain how. Again, I'm happy to share the full PDF of this exercise with the audience. So in the part one, this is typical. I ask them to open Google Scholar or other databases and search for similar papers, and then find the main plot or visualization of that paper and criticize that.
39.6.
What does that mean?
And in part two, I asked them to use Research Rabbit. I don't know if you've seen this platform or not, but it's far from perfect. But it's an AI platform that does literature review for you. And an interesting part about Research Rabbit is that it clusters the papers by field, and it allows you to see where you are with respect to other subfields in economics, or even other fields like law and housing and so on. So I asked them to add these papers to Research Rabbit and then show me where they are in the literature, where this question is in the literature. And then in the third step, I asked them to find 10 relevant papers and use ChatGPT to summarize them, create a table that has these 4 columns: citation, data, method, and results, and report it. So this is the student's work. This is the Research Rabbit work, a picture where you can see the clusters of the papers, and even if it's not comprehensive if you work with it, and it doesn't always give you the best papers in the topic, but just seeing the clusters and where you are is very helpful for a second or third year level student to understand what the literature is, how do I relate to these different fields, and so on. And this is one page of the work that this student did for the summary for the literature review. And again, I asked them to verify all of the citations, verify the data, method, everything, and make sure that GPT is not hallucinating. And one interesting thing about this exercise was that this wasn't just an exercise that I did and forgot about. Students were coming back to these tables repeatedly throughout the semester. They were coming to me saying that, well, this paper works with this extra data set. Where can I find it? Or my results are different from this particular paper. How do I interpret my results now that I have the opposite relationship, for example? So this was a very, very quick and easy, but very helpful exercise that allowed them to learn how to learn and challenge themselves and finally understand what I mean by situate your paper within the literature. So I'm going to quickly conclude by my take about what a good course, what a good future-oriented course should look like, and what elements should be included in that course. And also, my second point is that we can tick these boxes using the AI tools and ChatGPT. We have to think more carefully and stronger about critical thinking and problem-solving skills. This has to be the first, the most important goal of any course that has this future perspective. Interdisciplinary knowledge will be super helpful. Jobs will be more diverse. We have to teach students to learn on their own because we have new things come in every day. And data literacy will be important, not just to teach them how to code, but to teach them how to think. And also creativity and innovation will always pay off. So that's all I have. Again, thank you so much for having me. It's an amazing conference.
Thanks a lot, Nazneen. You've got some really wonderful comments in the chat, which I'm sure you'll be pleased to read. So everyone's praising about the relevance of this course, the kind of student engagement it brings in. Just a couple of probably 2 clarification questions quite quickly, and then we can take the questions towards the end, or you can also see them in the chat. There was this, when you started about awarding marks to implement the feedback. So I think there was this question, I believe it was from Carlos. How do you measure that? How do you measure whether the feedback has been implemented?
Sure. So, the feedback that we reevaluate is usually quite clear. For example, a student is working with the crime data, and in project 1, they create a map of number of crimes. And we know that this isn't really informative. It has to be per capita. And we ask them to find the population measure for each zip code, for example, and create this per capita measure for crime and create a new map. So this is easy to observe in the new project. And if they think that like it's not relevant, they have to explain in the new project that like this new measure that you asked of me is not relevant to the research question that I'm looking at.
Brilliant. Right, one more that was from Christian. So when the students generate questions using GPTs, are they allowed to use and rewrite those questions to just make their own better?
Yes, exactly. So it's in step 2, they are required to add their input, and even in the prompt, they can say, I'm more interested in, for example, crime and diversity, like go to that direction. So it's a very dynamic and back and forth process.
Brilliant. Right, thanks a lot, Nazneen. We'll move to the second talk, but we'll come back to you when we discuss in the open panel. Right, thanks a lot. I'm sure we can all give Nazneen some reactions using the virtual round of applause or hearts that we can make use of those apps. Brilliant, thanks, Christine. Right, so we next have Teddy Savrunas from Harvard Kennedy School. We'll be talking about custom chatbots. Right, Teddy, over to you.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. And thanks, Nazneen, for such an interesting talk. I think this actually pairs nicely with it in that you're really focusing on how you can develop students' ability to use ChatGPT or LLMs well. This talk is about how we as faculty could potentially leverage these LLMs, particularly in this case, ChatGPT, to potentially give interesting and useful learning experiences to students, sort of aside from actually developing their ability to use AI effectively. So high level, about a year after ChatGPT was announced, they introduced this thing called GPTs, which was the idea of making custom chatbots for whatever thing that you want to do. Right now, you need a paid version of ChatGPT to make these bots, but anybody with a link to it can interact with it. So it's free to use, but not free to actually make them. And what was really interesting about this development is that a chatbot was a no-code solution, in that all you did was provided instructions, just text for a prompt. You could provide it files that it should reference or use in some particular way, and then that was it. It became a chatbot. And what was interesting about this is that it turned the challenge of integrating LLMs into teaching from a technological problem to a pedagogical one. It became a question of how should we use these effectively? How can we make them give students more effective experiences? And so I've been experimenting with LLMs quite a bit before fall of 2023. And the question I asked myself when going into this next course, which was a stats course for first-year policy students in the master's program here at the Kennedy School, the question I asked myself, and the thing that I encourage you to ask yourself when thinking about how to use these tools, is what would you do with or for your students if you had unlimited copies of yourself? Now, that's not totally accurate for a lot of reasons, obviously, but it's a very useful exercise to think about what is sort of the thing for which time or energy is the limiting factor. And for me, the thing was I had a lot of students, especially in the middle of the distribution, who were being exposed to the concepts in my course and who wanted practice problems. And I had many years of practice problems available to them, and they still wanted more. They still wanted to develop very specific things that I was teaching them. And so the thing that I decided that I wanted to build out was a set of skills that weren't the goal of the course, but were kind of intermediate steps in being able to use the goals of the course more effectively. The goals being to be able to conduct statistical analyses, to interpret them effectively, and to translate them to policy relevant scenarios. So these sorts of bite-sized skills, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, were things like interpreting probabilities effectively from prose to notation, actually solving probability problems, doing a decision analysis problem, and this last one, which I think is maybe the hardest, is trying to explain ideas to a policymaker who's not well versed in statistics. So to give you just an example of how these look, I'm going to talk briefly about this second one, practicing with probability tables, to give you a sense of what these instruction sets actually look like. The thing that I hope you'll notice is that the instruction sets are basically the same as if I were to write a training document for a TA for how I want them to do a particular thing. It's simply a set of instructions. The more detailed, the better, and the more examples you can give, the better. So here's high level what the prompt is looking. Here's the prompt that I'm giving ChatGPT. Your goal is to develop students' ability to calculate probabilities based on a public policy scenario. Make up a public policy problem and have 2 events that each have their own probabilities, and ask the student to solve for some set of probabilities. If they get the problem wrong, or if they have questions and need helping you walk through it, use a 2x2 probability table, which is one of the methods we used to talk about calculating probability, to explain it. This was the whole prompt it was given, and so students could go and talk to it. And here's an example using just the ChatGPT interface of a problem that it made. So here's a scenario. A public health department is trying to analyze the effectiveness of a vaccine. It makes up these numbers for who received them versus not, who contracted the disease, who didn't. And it asks for 3 probabilities: the probability that a participant got the vaccine, got the disease, or both got the vaccine and got the disease. And so you can try to answer the question. If you answer it incorrectly, it might sort of help you walk through it, and so forth. In this example, I said, I really don't know, can you help me? And it lays it out in the way that I would like that to lay out, in that it really focused on creating this 2x2 probability table. It then walks them through each calculation and so on and so forth. And it really helps them just practice this kind of thing. Once you're done, you can ask for a new scenario. You could ask for a different context. You could ask for an easier or harder problem. I had one student who asked for more problems, but asked it to use easy numbers that she could calculate in her head, because she was doing this in bed before she went to sleep and didn't have like a calculator in hand. So she just wanted like access to, the point wasn't the math, the point was turning it into probabilities. And so she just asked for simple numbers, but in a new context, and it gave them things like that. So this is an example of the kinds of things that chatbots can do. I'm now going to show you a much more complicated one, which is really one of the key goals of the course, which is a lot of these students are not going to be statisticians or econometricians or economists. They're going to be out in the real world, reading newspapers, trying to talk to folks and trying to make new policies. And these concepts are going to be used sort of incorrectly in lots of ways. And it's up to them to identify incorrect uses and help to kind of solidify it in some way. So here's high level what this prompt is. The idea is that I'm asking ChatGPT to take on the persona of a policymaker who is curious and interested, but not well versed in statistics, okay? And so what the bot is going to do now is present a scenario, a policy-related scenario, and it's going to misuse a statistical concept from the course. And then the student's task is to correct that misunderstanding in a way that is not only technically correct, but actually accessible to somebody who might not know these contexts. So here's an example of the kinds of concepts that it can ask about: means versus medians, how to think about standard deviation, things along these lines. And then once the student answers, they need to evaluate whether the explanation was correct, explain in accessible terms, and using an example specific to the scenario's context. So this is all just back prompt that the bot has. So I loaded this into a custom chatbot, and here's what it said. As a policymaker, I'm looking at a report on health outcomes of a new wellness program in the city. The average participant now takes fewer sick days, which clearly shows that almost every individual is benefiting from the program. Can you explain what I'm sort of doing wrong here? And so I said the average is just the mean value, so it's possible that people are not all people are benefiting. And it said, you're on the right track, but here's a bit more detail. It gives it sort of a sample answer that might be more effective. And I asked for feedback on the response, and it said, yes, there is technical correctness to what you said, and it was concise and straightforward. However, there wasn't actually much examples, or there wasn't much richness to your answer that could have helped a policymaker understand things better. And so it actually gives nice feedback in this regard. I have found that It's not very good at like assigning a score to how well a student responds. It's much better at giving qualitative feedback. So I wouldn't say, give the student a grade from 1 to 10 on how well they did on each of these. But this is like exactly the kind of things that I ask my students to do with each other as often as possible to practice talking about these concepts in the real world. They now have this opportunity to be able to practice this on their own in a way that I think is quite effective. So all of this was very, very exciting. The challenge that it sort of brought to my mind was the fact that sometimes these models can be wrong, right? They can incorrectly say things, they can incorrectly compute math, things along those lines. I'd say now with GPT-4o, which is now also freely available to everyone, is that the amount of what we call hallucinations is a lot lower than anything I've seen previously. Regardless, it could still be inaccurate. So we certainly tell students if there's any concerns about the accuracy of what it's saying or something that's confusing, the whole teaching team is here to help you. So you can ask us on Slack, you can send us a thread, things along those lines. But we still wanted a little bit more transparency into what was happening. So we bundled the OpenAI API, which lets you make these custom chatbots, into a platform that we call Ping Pong, in that you're going back and forth with the chatbot. And basically it allows teachers to just make these chatbots in a very similar interface to how ChatGPT does it. But a very nice thing that you get in addition is transparency. So you can actually see the interactions that students are having with these custom chatbots. And this is all transparent to students. They know that this is happening. And so it allows us, the teaching team, or me, the faculty member, to really kind of scrutinize to try to see, is it giving relatively accurate answers? Is it confusing people in some ways? Are people asking things of it that it's not currently able to do? Things along those lines. That gives me a lot of insight into how I can make these things better. So we did this in the fall. I'd say about 60% of people used it at least once a month. About 68% of students found it effective or very effective to enhance their learning. To give you some ideas for why, here are some of the examples they gave. It helped with code practice. It helped with practice exams. You can see in the second to last row, someone said, while it was slightly annoying, I appreciated that it engaged in conversation as opposed to just telling the answer every time. This is something that you can kind of give in the kind of feedback that it has. This is just one of the many use cases that we've been experimenting with chatbots. This is just practice problems. Other use cases include, that we've been trying, a virtual TA that has all the course documents that it can reference, the ability to quiz students on the syllabus. I basically have it ask them questions about the course of the first week of class because nobody reads the syllabus, and then they come to me halfway through the semester asking a question that was already on the syllabus. So I tell the bot what kinds of questions to ask it about the syllabus and give it access to it to answer. You can help it can be a very good debate partner to help you practice debates about real world issues. It could provide feedback to students based on a rubric that you give it before they submit a thing. And so the kind of takeaways I want you all to hopefully think about as you try to potentially experiment with this in your own work is, again, what would you do with students if you had more time, more versions of yourself to potentially work with them? And then think about this truly pedagogically. What are the interactions that you want students to be able to do to get better at the content that you're trying to teach them? Can it adopt real world personas? Is it about practice problems? And truly, when you write these prompts, first of all, treat the prompt like a training guide, like you're actually giving somebody instructions. And secondly, as you can imagine, it's really important to stress test these prompts. So ask your teaching team, ask your friends, ask your colleagues, whatever, to just use this bot a bunch of times. Try to get them to, jailbreak the bot by getting it to do something different, try to see how accurate it is, really kind of put it through its paces before you let it out into the world of your students. But all in all, it's an incredibly powerful tool that it's enabling me to do things that I've really always wanted to do that now I sort of feel like I'm starting to be able to. So thanks very much. Looking forward to the next presentation.
And thanks a lot, Teddy. Again, some really good comments for you and also questions. Just two quick clarification ones. Possibly one is might be straightforward. How much time did it take you to design the whole chatbot and do those iterations? And was there any point in time where the response was actually wrong?
Great. So the answer to the first question is writing a bot can take like literally 5 minutes. This set of ones, I would say for each of them probably took me about maybe like 20 minutes or 30 minutes to refine in the way that I wanted it to give the exact kind of problems that I wanted it to. And as I said, there's so much iteration and refining that you have to do as people start using it. With respect to it being wrong, sometimes it does actually happen, though I do find when that happens, the most common scenario is it tells a student that they were wrong and then shows them the work and then gets the same answer as the student and then says, oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong, you were right, right? So it's very uncommon in what I've seen so far that it just completely gets the wrong answer entirely. Rather, it doesn't do the step-by-step work that I think it needs to get its work done. And so my refined prompts tell it first solve this step-by-step, then evaluate the student's answer based on that, and then it's gotten a lot more accurate.
Does the faculty review the student interaction, or is there any sort of fraction of student interaction that's reviewed by the faculty or by yourselves?
Yeah, so we sort of like keep an eye on these threads basically like every couple of days just to see how people are using it. Students are aware of it, and they obviously like it's not really a way to make sure they're not cheating because they could just very easily go to ChatGPT, you know, the commercial version and answer the questions. But I find that students liked the fact that they knew that their interactions were like kosher in that they were doing things that I approved of. And secondly, they had some solace in knowing that there was like some checks to make sure that it was being accurate. And I think that also helped a lot as well.
Right, perfect. Thanks, Teddy. We'll come back to you when we open the floor for panel discussion. Right, moving on again, but before I forget, virtual round of applause for Teddy as well, please. And we'll now move on to Christian Toad, also joined by his colleague Omar Siraj.
Yes, I think he's in the audience.
Right.
All right, so thank you everybody to great talk so far. I hope I can contribute a tiny little bit. Today, I want to talk about the quality of ChatGPT responses, the off-the-shelf version for student self-study. This is joint work with Nathalie Bröse and Omar Siraj from my university and Christian Spielmann from the University of Bristol. So, I mean, we talked about it already today. There's this new technology, and as economists, we're interested in what does that mean for productivity, and we think about learning. It's about learning productivity of students. And if you think about it, this has like two steps. We have one step where the chatbot creates an output, and then the students uses this output as an input to his or her production function that generates then a more effective or more efficient learning experience. And our focus for now is we want to understand what is the accuracy and quality of this off-the-shelf ChatGPT version if asked about economic concepts and multiple choice questions from economics. And then we try to learn from this, how can we guide students in using this technology to have a more effective learning experience and to mitigate the risks of AI-generated hallucinations. Because time is...
I don't think your slide... Yeah, sorry. The same point as Christian was mentioning. Christian, your slides, we can't see your slides.
Okay, that's, oh, thank you. Maybe I shared the wrong screen. Let me, can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So you haven't missed much so far. Sorry for that. So there's a lot of literature coming up right now, and because of the time, I just want to focus on two things. We see that in some applications, these chatbots perform pretty well, and in others not so well. And if we think about student adoptions, there are two great papers that found, for one, that the performance expectancy of a chatbot is an important driver for adoption of this technology for students. And the second is that even among students who are cautious about the truthfulness of responses, another paper finds that even among these cautious students often fail to identify wrong responses, wrong text produced by chatbots. And we just wanted to understand in a more structured way, how good are these responses? And we do this in two ways. We have two tasks. One is explaining simple economic context, and the other one is answering and explaining multiple choice questions. We have a total of 57 concepts and 25 multiple choice questions that we take from the textbook, The Economy 1.0 by Core the Economy, by Core Econ. Probably most of you know this textbook. For those of you who don't, it's a introductory level textbook for economics, micro and macroeconomics. It's less mathy, and it applies economic concepts early on to real world problems. How we approached this, we had Omar, which was our student assistant, experiment with different prompts for a long period of time, and then created responses for the concepts and multiple choice questions. And then Christian, Nathalie, and I rated the responses and moderated each other's ratings, such that we go from a more subjective evaluation to a more objective evaluation. And then we analyzed our ratings. Before I go into the results, some background. Omar found something that's also consistent with literature. A good prompt has like 3 basic information. The first one is assign a role to the chatbot. We also saw that in Teddy's presentation. Provide context and provide a clear task. So for example, for the concepts, it's you take on the role of a university tutor. That's the role for the course in economics. That's context. Assume that I have no prior knowledge of economics. That's again context. And then the task, explain to me the concept of this and that, and provide a simple example at the end. We rated the responses using marking grids. And just to give you a brief overview, we checked how frequent is this concept used. So is it a very common concept, not just in economics, or is it very uncommon? How difficult do we consider this concept to be? How accurate is the response, going from very wrong to very accurate? What is the scope of the explanation? Does it explain the entire concept or just a tiny little part of it? How appropriate is the response for the target audience? What is the quality of the example? Is it a very good example with a practical example, or is it an incorrect or no example at all? And then we also looked into what is the safety of the, is there anything regarding safety? So is the response presented as absolute fact, or does it discuss the limitation and maybe even provide credible sources? Then we also wanted to understand what types of errors are there. So is it a comprehension error that the chatbot just doesn't understand the prompt? Is it a factual error where the chatbot fails to get the right information from its knowledge base? Or is it an inference error, which is that it makes a statement and then fails to reason correctly based on the statement that it made? Then we also wanted to understand the error domain, and this is a bit more complicated. A closed error domain means that a careful reader can, just by reading the chat, see that something is wrong here and identify that this is a mistake. Or on the other hand, an open domain error is if you only understand that this is a mistake by doing extensive research outside of the chat. We did the same for the multiple choice questions, with the only difference. So these multiple choice questions are provide some background information, and then there are four statements, and the chatbot has to evaluate which one of these statements is correct. And we asked the chatbot to provide information on which statement is correct and provide an explanation why that is the case. So we also counted how many answers are correct and how many explanations are correct. And before I now jump into the results, just a quick heads up, this is still work in progress. So these are preliminary results. And the marking grid gives us ordinal variables, but for now, we will analyze them as if they were continuous variables. This is something that we will change for the paper later on. So let's start with concepts and the accuracy of explanations. We find that both GPT 3.5 and GPT 4o perform reasonably well when explaining certain concepts. We find a score of approximately 4 out of 5. That means on average, explanations are pretty good. And if there are mistakes, they are more often just in the details of certain concepts. We find that performance is better for more frequently used concepts, which makes sense if you think about how these models are trained. So if a concept is occurring more often in the training data, the weights of the neural net are, more solid regarding this concept. And if you have concepts that are rarely used, think of marginal rate of transformation, which is used quite often in the economy, but not so often in other textbooks, you will find that performance will be worse. We also find that the difficulty of a context has no impact on accuracy. Things look a little bit worse for the scope of explanations. We see that the scope is much lower. What does that mean? Let me tell you by example. So if asked about asymmetric information, both chatbots will discuss adverse selection and moral hazard. But when talking about moral hazard, it will focus on just risk-taking and not about hidden actions in general. So the explanation is correct, but the focus is narrower than it should be. It then gets even worse for the examples that the chatbots provide, because very often the examples are weak or unhelpful. In many cases, it will just come up with a very simple calculation example. So for example, when asked about aggregate demand, it will come up with an example saying, okay, consumption is 500 billion, investment is 300 billion, and government spending and so forth. And the example is then just, okay, add up these 4 to 5 numbers, and this is aggregate demand. Things get even worse when taking a look at macroeconomic concepts. Think of the marginal propensity to consume. It can explain the, the aggregate nature of marginal propensity to consume, but when coming up with an example, it falls into a microeconomic explanation. So there's this one household and the income of one household increases, and this and that happens with consumption. What errors do we observe? And for the concepts, we see the most common mistakes are factual errors. So there's just the responses are wrong. There's just the explanation, the mistakes are based on errors in the knowledge base or while retrieving information from the knowledge base. We also find that most errors are open. That means many students will not be able to identify these mistakes without doing extensive research outside of the chat. About the multiple choice questions, we find for the first time really that there is a huge difference between these models. GPT 3.5 fails, incorrectly answers in 33, so in 1/3 of cases. Also, the explanations are wrong in 1/3 of the cases. GPT-4o improved this substantially, so only in 7 or 8% of cases the answers are wrong and the explanations are wrong. So a huge improvement here. Interestingly, we find that GPT 3.5 struggles with consistency. So in approximately 20% of cases, almost 20% of cases, we see that answers and explanations are contradictory. So it might, what does that mean? It might say that statement 1 is correct, then provides an explanation, and the conclusion of the explanation is that this statement is actually incorrect. This is something that happens with 3.5. This rarely happens with 4o. When we take a look at the error types and error domains, we find that for both models, and this is just showing the results for 3.5, we have a more even distribution of error types. And interestingly, the most frequent error type is the comprehension error. Most errors are still open though, but we have more closed errors now. So what does that mean? We find that well-written questions exercises with sufficient context give better results. And this leads to, I think, an important finding of our study. So what do we make of all of this? This is still work in progress, so this might change. First of all, I haven't shown you this, but we find that answers are, in general, very well tailored to the target group, but everything is presented as fact. Never, ever did it mention that there are potentially limitations in what the chatbot is writing. So no surprise here, we have to raise awareness and teach critical thinking about using this technology. We find that the explanations of the concepts are good, independent of the model, but very often they lack precision. And this means this is not a substitute for a good textbook where a human author put in time and effort to make sure that the concept is presented in a holistic and easily to understand way. We find that performance is worse for infrequently used concepts. This gives us something that we can do because we can then highlight concepts that might not work well with this technology. Think of the marginal rate of transformation, or think of the bargaining gap, something that you use in your course, which might not be in every course on micro or macroeconomics. For question answering, we find 4o performs pretty good, so only recommend that. Don't recommend 3.5 for these types of tasks. And I think what is very interesting is that both models struggle with comprehension and question answering. And if you think about it, it makes sense because it takes these multiple choice questions out of a book that is embedded in text. And so it takes the question out of its context. And if then the question is not very clearly written, the chatbot will fail to provide a clear and correct answer. And I think this is a tool for us because very often I think we're also prone to the curse of knowledge. We have a context in mind, and when we write a question or an exercise, we think about how we think the students will understand this, but this is not clear. So we can just put this exercise on our text into the chatbot and see how the chatbot responses and hopefully identify when our writing is not just as clear as we hope it is. Yeah, and what's coming next for us? We will test the consistency of responses. This is still to come. And then what we hope to do is we'll want to do an experiment with the students and hopefully understand who benefits from using this technology and in what way. So thank you very much.
Right, thanks a lot, Christian. Really fascinating comments and questions for you in the chat, but I'd like you to keep your microphone on and probably, I know you haven't created a bot, and the other Christian in in the audience has kind of answered that question, but would you be fascinated now to create a bot, a customized chat bot, rather?
Yeah, definitely. This is something that we could think about as an add-on, but to be honest, our university is not so far that we can apply these technologies officially. So we're still using this workaround. We know the students use it. So what can we do to give the students the best experience, even though our university hasn't yet decided on how to use this technology?
Right. And I mean, I know that we now have 4 as sort of a free version, in quotes, but has there ever been an issue around equal access to GPT technology among students?
I don't think so, but I'm not so sure. Maybe somebody knows. I thought the 4.0 access is just limited. And it's
Yes,
just
yeah.
for test purposes. So there might be the risk that we fall back to 3.5 for the free users. And this would then create, a problem for students who can't afford having the paid access to this chatbot. Yes.
I'm pretty sure Teddy could probably help us answer that question, but as far as I know, that you can now explore GPTs even in 3.5. So if you had created a custom GPT instead, then someone who's using 3.5 version could explore your GPT with the free version as well.
Sorry, are you asking Teddy or me?
Well, in a way, but I kind of read Teddy's comment in that it's the new free version. So
That's right. So ChatGPT has made 4.0 their new default model.
Okay.
Instead of 3.5. There are message limits to how many interactions you can have, but I think it's because it was like way more efficient in some way, and 3.5 was making them look bad because it kept getting things wrong. So they've made 4.0 the new sort of standard for the free accounts.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Brilliant. Right. Virtual round of applause for Christian as well before we take some specific questions. And I also think there's one more person who's working diligently in the background. That's Ramin. He's collating all the questions for us. So thanks, Ramin, for that. A few specific questions now. Nazneen, probably I'll start with you. So when you use ChatGPT, how do you address any of those academic integrity sort of concerns? Are there any measures that you use to ensure that students' work is original? So how do you go about that?
Well, it's not great. I can't say for sure that nothing is going on, but students upload their work into our platform, and it's being there. This is one way. We give them individual feedback, and they have to do that thing that we're asking for. So they can't really copy and paste. It has to be the exact assignment that we gave them. And also they have to check in with the TA every week and explain their progress, and they upload their code to GitHub every week, so we see how the code evolves over time, and they present their work. They upload a video of themselves presenting at the end of the semester. It's a lot of work for us, but it kind of gets at that academic integrity concern, but I can't say for sure that we are fully addressing that. It's a relevant point. I don't really have a perfect solution.
Right. And have there been any sort of specific challenges that you yourself as an educator have encountered while integrating this GPT in your course?
So I think we have our own ways of teaching and designing our courses, and some things look and sound so obvious that we don't really see a role for ChatGPT. For example, like thinking about the research question is just something that you just read papers and you think, but using ChatGPT and other AI can make it better, and you can get to the end result faster. So I think this is one challenge, to think about every element of the course differently, and also think about, am I teaching students something that will be helpful in that future job market? That's not necessarily based on how well you code or how much you've memorized or how well you can solve an equation. And this is something that I'm continuously thinking about.
Brilliant. Right, Teddy, over to you. A few questions for you as well. Again, probably, how do you ensure the accuracy and reliability of the content that's provided by the chatbot?
Yeah, so I mean there are two ways you can do it. One is in your inputs. You can really work on the prompt and try to make it as effective as possible. You can give it documents to go from. There's a thing called chain of thought prompting where you get the bot to, before it gives an answer, write out each step of the way, because it's been found that a lot of LLMs, when asked to answer a question, will just give the wrong answer all at once. But if you ask them to break it down into steps, then they'll get it right. So things like that. And then the other end is checking or asking students to, if there's any uncertainty about the answer, that we have a full teaching team available to them. Yeah, I think those are the two sides of it. I did have a thought with respect to students using AI to sort of cheat in various ways. I've become pretty convinced that there is no assignment in that is, except for sitting in a classroom with a blue book, that is like AI-able. Like, it's getting so good now that you can fully upload your existing paper and then upload the feedback you got and say, give me a new one with the new feedback. And the thing with going entirely to blue books is I think that then you're getting away from the actual core skills that we're trying to teach, right? Like, there's no integrity issues, but you're just teaching them to do a very specific set of things in a classroom instead of really thinking more broadly. So my thinking about this has evolved to just being, you need to make it so that the costs of learning are such that the people who actually want to learn will do so, and the people that don't. In the Kennedy School, what I tell them is, like, you might think that your degree is incredibly valuable on its own, but what really matters when you go out into the world is what you can do. And so if you've cheated yourself by giving us your money in tuition and then didn't learn anything, like, okay, go ahead, right? So it's really important to kind of make people aware of the need to embrace their own learning, because I think that's the only chance we have.
Yeah, I can't agree more. It's definitely important to have that sort of conversation with your students, isn't it? There's another question from Ralph for you. So you were able to see the student queries that are sent to the chatbot. So are they very different from what they would have asked you directly?
They're so different. Like, we try really hard in my class to create a norm of, there's no bad question, no matter how basic or simple. Please come talk to us. That's why we're here. We want to help your learning. And the amount of students who go to the chatbot and say, like, what is conditional probability? Like, what does it even mean? I couldn't believe it, compared to the ones that, we come to office hours or come to ask questions to us. There's a certain willingness to ask really basic questions that no matter what we do, we can't quite get them to be comfortable talking to a TA about it or talking to me about it. So it really has changed. I think there is a much bigger willingness to ask very fundamental questions that they would consider to be embarrassing to ask a person.
And if there was a case of using any other e-learning tool, let's say a Padlet or a Post-it wall, where they could just anonymously ask questions, would you think that that would have been very different from what they
I would think that would be better. We have in our Slack, for example, we have the ability to ask anonymous questions and things like that. And the frequency with which people are doing it is still way lower than the chatbot. I think the fact that you can just pull it out and on your phone and type it and get an immediate answer really does change things for people. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out the mechanisms why, but it's like a level of question asking that I haven't been able to get through any other means.
It's almost like having a self-help tool or a companion with you who would answer to your question. And I was listening to you when you talked about your students on looking around, questions when they go to bed, and so the timing could be at any time. You could just pick up ChatGPT on custom chatbot and ask that question. Another thing was that were there tasks that for which the chatbot has proven to be not so useful? Were there any specific tasks or topics?
So a couple things. One is I found that it is not that good if you upload a lot of documentation and you ask for what's every part in the course where we've talked about conditional probability. It's surprisingly not that good at getting every instance of talking about conditional probability. I think this is because the model is meant to find a pretty good answer from the documents and then use that and not continue to searching at that point for computational resources purposes. So it's really not as good at being comprehensive as you might expect or think of like a bot to do. Like I said before, I think it's much worse at assigning grades or assigning scores to things, though a comment was made, like maybe if you really worked on refining the bot to like give grades in a particular way, maybe you can get it to be better. That's certainly possible, but I'm still not yet at a place where I basically focus on qualitative feedback for students that the bot gives for now.
Right. I'll probably come back to you again, Teddy, but we'll take a few questions from Christian. So I think there was this question by Parama in the chat that how does this, which the other Christian in the audience had kind of answered that this is not a custom chat bot. So, but how do you fare with, using answers to ADAS models, whereas, following a completely different approach to answering those questions?
Sorry, can you rephrase it, your question maybe?
So how does this use of GPT 3.5 or 4 fare with common issues like using ADAS model, whereas core could have the textbook could have a completely different approach?
Yeah, that's a good point. In our rating, we had cases where the explanation went to a completely different way than what core used, and in this case we said, okay, this is not what we're looking for because we teach with the core material, and this is of course a problem that we don't have a solution for.
Right. Okay. And I think there was another clarification question. So what were the number of observations in your analysis?
Yeah, so we have 57 concepts that we asked the chatbot. We did it in German and English. So 57 times 2, and then for 2 chatbots, so times 2 again. And this includes everything basically from, for those who know the textbook, it's taken from Unit 1 to Unit 16. So everything that you would use in the fundamentals course. And for the multiple choice questions, it's 25 per language and chatbot.
Right. Okay. Right. Thanks, Christian. And I think you mentioned in your talk about more factual errors, but were there any particular topics where you thought that GPT tends to produce more inaccuracies?
Yeah, we try to also, classify concepts and questions by JEL codes and try to understand whether we see something particular bad in these types of topics. We don't find that. It's really what seems to explain the most is how frequently used is this concept, and something that I don't know, the unemployment rate being something that is super frequently used, not just in economics, this works perfect. But if you go into something more, detailed topics of particular fields of economics, then the accuracy drops quickly.
Right, brilliant. And as far as I know, now we do have a microphone function with any of these chatbots or GPT, and you could speak into it and ask the question. Would you think that they could be sort of, the linguistic diversity could bring in more inaccuracies into using these functions?
Well, that's a good question. We haven't tried that, but
what could be the error rate according to you if someone's just speaking it to ChatGPT?
I think, because I teach mostly in German, so we definitely have this language barrier, and what we also see in the data. So if you compare asking for a German explanation for the German concept and the English concept, you see that it translates the prompt into English and then the response back into German. And if you have voice input in German that gets then transcribed into German and then translated back, I think this will definitely incorporate new errors that we don't have a good understanding of yet.
Right, and could there be any sort of feedback mechanisms that you would want to put in place for the students to deal with inaccuracies? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I think we started this project because we have not such a feedback process yet. We wanted to understand how good it is and give this as a guidance to the students. And we have this forum where students can interact with us teachers. But as Teddy said, this is hard to use because of embarrassment for, I don't know, asking this simple question. And I make the same observations. And I think this might be a problem for such a feedback mechanism.
Right, I don't mean to put any spotlight, but we do have your co-authors in the audience if they'd want to add anything around, any topics that relate more to inaccuracies, any sort of feedback mechanism, dealing with any different functions, or, students using 3.5 versus 4. So, I mean, have you had any sort of conversations? The other Christian in the audience, or maybe Omar, again, no spotlight on anyone, but if you want to
can say
add
one thing.
anything.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, I think the answers were a bit poorer on the macro side. It seems like it's easier to, I don't know, maybe micro is just more defined. It's more technical little thing, and macro we might also want a more holistic approach to the concepts. So I think that's one thing we have noticed, I think.
Right, brilliant. Right, so I'll probably move back to Teddy again. So we've got a couple of minutes, not a couple of minutes, we've got plenty of minutes. So I may have a few more questions in addition. Right, so the same question probably around a metrics or a feedback mechanism where you evaluate whether students actually learning through your custom chatbots. Have you put that sort of in place?
It's a great question and an important one that we really like to do in more depth. We haven't yet. We've just focused on anecdotes and, like I said, the student feedback itself on their interactions with the bot. We're currently in talks to do an RCT across a bunch of community colleges in the US, so where we can actually randomize access to these tools for free versus not. You can't really do that at a classroom level for a lot of reasons, as you can imagine. And community colleges potentially are very good candidate for this kind of thing, in that they tend to be a lot more resource constrained and harder to give personalized feedback and help to students. So we're hoping to get more evidence down the road, but for now, all we have are these anecdotes.
Brilliant. And just in terms of student preferences, I know you've used different styles where a chatbot could be used as a tutor or a practitioner. Do students prefer a specific role for the chatbot?
I think students really do want a chatbot that just tells them the answers to questions. So it's pretty important that we prompt it in a way that say, no matter what, it's a tricky needle to thread, because like you can imagine obviously a lot of questions where they say, what's the answer? And they say, well, let's talk through it. But there are other things like coding questions for us when it's like, I'm getting this error, I don't know what to do. And we don't want the chatbot to say, well, why do you think there's an error? And like, just go back and forth in circles about a very, very basic thing. So you have to kind of like find some sweet spot, and it's a hard thing to do. But that has, I think people have really sort of expressed a little bit of frustration, but understanding why that, like, we have it take a more Socratic approach to how to think about things. I had a student who, this is actually the same student who was doing it in bed. She said that she had it have all the examples be from like Game of Thrones episodes. So it would like, the characters and the personas were different people from Game of Thrones, or you just ask it to do whatever you want and it can do it in that way. And that kind of customization, I think, can be pretty funny. Christian asked if it's
Yes.
available to the world. Right now, the ping pong part, we are like rolling it out to other institutions and folks. If you are particularly interested, just get in touch with me. It's not like a website you sign up for. We're kind of trying to do it on a selected basis. But if you're interested in doing so, please let me know, and we can get you set up.
I'll pitch this idea to CTIL that we should do a hands-on training session with you, Teddy. Perhaps you could teach us how to build a custom chatbot, maybe only
Totally.
5-10 minutes, but that would be really, really interesting. Right, I'll come back to all of you on a very specific question, but one for Nazneen. There's a question in the chat, Nazneen, for you, that do you use all these tools to develop your own research questions and write your own papers?
So well, I did it recently. I had an old idea using a data that I had for a while, and I just followed my prompts, and it led to a working paper that I'm working on right now. So yeah, I think my main point in this presentation is giving students guided instructions about how to use AI in which parts of the process can be very productive.
Mm.
Just telling them in general that like use ChatGPT to get help is not enough, because they don't know where the end point is. They don't know where the end of a paper is supposed to be. So just giving them guided instructions about different parts, like research question, coming up with the literature review. I have another exercise where I ask them to simulate a data set and then run all the possible analysis that they're hoping to run on that simulated data set, and then see how it looks like at the end. Like, and this is what you were hoping to get at the end of research paper. So we can design images for students using ChatGPT and AI to help them save more time and also broaden their perspective about what is possible, and allow them to be more creative, and also think about potential challenges early on. And this is something that like even PhD students struggle with. They start a project, halfway through the project, they realize that it's not possible. They panic, they change supervisors. So we can prevent some of these problems. But it kind of requires us to reevaluate our courses, which can be difficult if you have taught a certain course for a few iterations. It's hard to go back and redesign a course based on this new world.
And your students do put a disclaimer when they submit their assignments that they've used so-and-so tool. Do they have to disclose it? And do you also ask for prompts?
So I'm still figuring this out, but in the previous iteration of the course, I put in the syllabus that all work has to be yours, all text has to be yours, and even if you're using GPT, you have to write it in your own words. I couldn't really enforce it, but yeah, it's if anyone has any suggestions, it's a hot topic, it's a hot discussion. I don't really have a good solution for it, but
I think personally on our assessment briefs, we've put instructions that students can use AI for, let's say, X and Y use, but they have to then disclose that they've used it. So whether they have used it or whether they haven't used it, they still have to specify very clearly in their assignments. And sometimes students also give away the prompts they've used. So I think that's how I've tweaked my assessment briefs now to include that, because it's kind of an interesting way to see that how students move from just asking a simple question as to, let's say, what's the conceptual framework, to a more advanced question. So kind of helps them build on those prompts, or you can even give feedback on the prompts. So yeah.
I require them to use ChatGPT. So because of that, I didn't really ask them to give me a disclaimer, but I don't know how much is being directly used from ChatGPT, especially, their code. It's very hard to know.
And are you open to them using any other tool like Claude or Perplexity or even Copilot? Because now we can, at least at our institution, we can use our institutional logins to use Copilot. So are you open to that, or do they have to stick to ChatGPT?
No, they could use any platform.
Right, cool. All right, okay. So
Can I ask Nazanin a follow-up question?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just very curious, Nazanin. So the ChatGPT also has its own data analysis module where you can like upload stuff and tell it what to do. I don't know if we're there yet, but I'm curious if you thought about, like, there was a time when we were multiplying matrices and then we started using packages. Is there a point where it's, instead of actually coding, it's just our own language and telling it to do analysis? When do we start actually teaching students how to use ChatGPT to do the analysis, not just help them fix their code?
Yeah. So I have two answers, maybe. So I think that if you don't know how to code, it's very hard to judge the results that GPT gives you. So if you haven't ran a million regressions, it's hard to know if the result makes sense. So teaching how to code is still relevant. So you asked for 2 questions?
Well, that was the main one. So you think is there going to be a point where we just say, you know, the skill of being able to code line by line is no longer something that we're necessarily valuing, and instead we're relying on these bots, these tools to do the analysis themselves, and our input is what we ask it to do, what questions we ask about the assumptions it makes, and things along those lines.
Yeah. So if we think about our role in the future as prompt engineers, and then someone who chooses between like different outputs, if you don't know what's going on, or at least if you don't know the structure of the analysis, it's very hard to write the right prompt and also choose between the outcomes. So I think that maybe they don't have to memorize as much as they have to memorize now to code, but they still need to see the code, run regression, get errors, understand what collinearity is, and other things. So this is what I think in summer of 2024. I don't know what the future is going to look like, but I it's hard for me to imagine just working with ChatGPT, not knowing how a regression works, and being able to interpret it. So
great, thank you.
Thanks, Nazanin and Teddy. I think there's a follow-up question in the chat that Carlos probably put me on the spot, that, you know, I don't mean to detect the use of AI. So when my students say that they haven't used AI, it's not about that. I probably through the whole idea about disclosing is I want to encourage them to use it and feel confident that they can openly say that they've used it. Because at the end of this day, as even Teddy was saying, that, you know, we want to encourage the skills that they would then go into applying in when they go into the job market. So by disclosing, it's probably the get that confidence in you to, yes, accept that you've used ChatGPT or any other AI tool for the good purposes. So the whole purpose of disclosing is not to get any sort of, you know, ways to detect it or whether they've used it or not. So yeah. I have one big question, which probably comes to my mind because whenever I share anything to do with AI, whether it's custom board, there are always a set of colleagues who would ask me the question, have you looked at the terms and conditions? Is this institutionally allowed? How do you deal with those sort of questions? And how do you deal with, you know, those which are genuine around a data privacy or, you know, the ethical side or how students are interacting with it or the misuses? So how do you deal with the questions that, you know, if I were to say that you're suggesting this tool, but have you looked at the terms and conditions? What about data privacy? So how do you tackle those questions? So I don't know which order to go. Probably, Christian, you're giving me that smile, so probably I'll go with you first.
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to this. I mean, we as a university, we don't allow using this technology. There's a lot of talk, but there are no rules on it. So we just omit this question. We're not talking about terms and conditions. And this is also, I mean, like I already said, this is why we try to understand if students use it privately, how can they use this technology? Because we don't have no rules on this.
Okay, so no rules. Okay. Teddy, do you want to suggest how do you tackle those type of questions? Or, I mean, even especially when you design custom chatbots, how do you make sure that they're inclusive? You know, you look into the way students interact, the diversity of our students, and
yeah. So I mean, my inclination is to focus on the enabling abilities of these tools to actually make it things accessible that weren't previously, right? Like right now, the examples I give in class are things that I think are relevant, I hope are relevant to people, but students often come to me after class saying like, you know, I'm from here, or I grew up in this context, and like, why aren't you talking about housing? Why aren't you talking about homelessness? Like things along those lines, right? And so the ability of this stuff to start to customize things in ways that could potentially make it more accessible, I think really is potentially important and potentially transformative. I do think like ubiquity of access is quite important. Like imagine, you know, some people not having the internet and other people having the internet in the same classroom or in the same school is like impossible to think about now. But I think that's sort of happening in terms of like people's access to a lot of these models. So to me, if we're not taking equity as a central goal, this is going to happen on its own, right? This kind of division and inequality is going to just kind of emerge. And so I think it kind of is up to us.
And do you have any sort of institutional guidelines that suggest what's a good practice?
The way that we're trying to deal with this is we have a university-wide policy on use of AI tools. We're trying to make through things like ping pong, students have the same access to the same kinds of tools that they could potentially use for the classes that they're in. And we're hoping that is like getting us pretty close. But the thing is, like, you know, OpenAI's latest announcements of the stuff that they're adding are so head and shoulders above what existed like 4 months ago that the notion of us being able to like really keep up is quite difficult. I think what's nice about things like ping pong is that we're really kind of hitching our wagon to OpenAI's own API. So as they release stuff, then students have access to them. But otherwise, it's really, you know, it's the need to continue to make new features, and the scale of the progress is such that it does concern me, I think, a good amount.
Brilliant. Right, thanks, Teddy. Nazneen, what do you think about these considerations and university guidelines and use of AI?
Our institution is so big that I really don't know what's going on. And I think like it gets to our associate chair and he translates everything into some wording that we understand. And then but I know that there is some language being developed around that. And I know that we allow using it. And we have our own Copilot that's within U of T's teams and everything. So
I may have missed this question, so I'm just looking at the Google Doc again, but the use of AI or ChatGPT in all the courses that you design, especially around the research question, is that's optional or that you have to use it?
So it was an exercise. So whatever came out of that exercise didn't have to necessarily be the main research question. It was just to help them come up with different ideas, and they had to meet with our TAs every week and talk about that research idea. And so they were talking to me and a TA every week. They were talking to each other. So it's usually a semester long process to get to that final research question. But what this exercise did for us last semester was to help us get to that final stage faster. Usually I had to explain, like, challenge them to think about heterogeneities. What about low income? What about high income? What about regions closer to downtown? And this took a lot of time. And my class is about 200 students. So multiply that. Yeah, no, they didn't have to use what ChatGPT recommended.
Brilliant. Right, we still have 5 more minutes, but I'm probably, and this question is in the benefit of all of us. If you were to identify a training resource or a go-to place for yourself, I mean, are there any sort of, how do you keep up to date with all the latest developments around AI, especially within education? Are there any specific, do you follow somebody? I'm pretty sure everyone might have heard of Professor Ethan Mollick from Wharton Business School. He's kind of also now in the OpenAI education, partnering with that. So anyone else apart from him or any sort of resource? So Teddy, probably will start with you this time. So this is the final question, I promise, unless anyone
Sure.
else has any other to add.
So I have a bit of a self-interested promotion, which is that Dan Levy, who's one of the co-creators of this presentation, in 2020 summer, he tasked himself in the month of June to write a whole book about how to teach with Zoom. And he did it in a month, and it was really, really, really helpful to a lot of folks. And he's about 5 days away from finishing a book on how to teach with ChatGPT that I think he's going to release hopefully in the next month. So he's such a thoughtful teacher, definitely the most thoughtful instructor at the Kennedy School by a wide margin. I'm very excited to read this book. I've seen a little bit of like some of the chapters he's been working on, and I just think it's going to be super, super helpful. So I think he's going to release it on Amazon, just self-published in the coming week or so, hopefully. So
If
look
I
out for that,
may-
Dan Levy.
If I may request, is there any link that you could provide in the
Let
chat?
me
for
look
us?
around. Let me find something, and then I'll post in the chat.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Teddy. Nazneen, how do you keep up to date with any sort of latest developments? What's your go-to?
So I'm gonna reveal my secrets.
That's what we
Um,
want.
So I think that academia is falling behind industry. And what I do is that I sneak into Uber, Amazon, Google's GitHub pages, and I try to like learn things from industry, and then I bring that into my courses. So that's how I try to keep up. But I'm very excited about the books that Teddy mentioned. I
Yes,
think that's going to be an easier and more comprehensive way.
I think, yeah, me too. Christian?
Nothing special, keeping up with relevant people on social media, but I couldn't even tell you whom exactly, except for Ethan Mollick. And, we have a lot of discussion with our colleagues over lunch, and somebody learned something new. But yeah, no structured approach here. But I learned already a lot from this session today, stuff that I didn't have, that I didn't know about. So that's great.
Brilliant. Right, I think I'm going to bring this session to a close. So we have slightly more than 5 minutes for break, and then we will have our mixer session. But before we all leave, please may I request everyone to give another virtual round of applause to our wonderful presenters, and also Damien, who's been working diligently in the background. Again, Damien, thanks a lot for setting up all the questions for me. And yeah, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful having this conversation.
Thanks, everyone. See you at 6 o'clock or in 7 minutes.